Appreciate that prayer, Silas. If you have not been here thus far, I think these videos are all available on y'all's webpage or something, YouTube page. I don't know where you'd. But there are these note books back there at the back where you can follow along in this session this morning. And the bulk of the material covered today and this weekend is in this book, Flooded, in a very this is not very technical, okay? It's written on about a 9th grade level, so this is great for most people to be able to follow this material without it being too heavy. All right, the session this morning, you're going to understand why we really needed to do the sessions yesterday. It kind of prepares you for being able to make a defense of what the Bible teaches about, for example, the flood and creation. And yesterday, we had a session where we responded to Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, and his attacks on the biblical creation model. And so we dealt with one of the big issues that he brought up repeatedly, and that was the idea that the creation model isn't scientific because it can't make, he said, scientific predictions. And we showed that's simply not the case. He's just ignorant about really the creation model. But I do want to highlight some other points that he made that I thought were good points that Ken Ham did not deal with, and which we can deal with, but he did not do so. And so there's several other things that I'd like to cover this morning. We just won't have time, but let's try to get through. I think there's 7 of these. And so one of the things he said is, how can you have hundreds of thousands of years worth of layering in the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica if the Earth is only a few thousand years old? How can you have trees that are older than the flood and even creation in some cases? Civilizations with a history that go back further than the flood. How do you get animals out to Australia after the flood? If all the animals get wiped out, how do they then hop on out there to Australia? How do you start with a relatively few number of species on the ark, only 4,000 years ago, to the 16 million species on the planet today? That would translate to 11 new species emerging every day since the flood. Number 6, there's not even enough space on the ark for the 7,000 species, he said. And we have an actual example of a wooden vessel that was really large that ultimately proved itself not to be seaworthy, he said. It ultimately, because it was the length of its wooden planks, caused it to ultimately have leaks and sink on the open sea. So let's go ahead and plow through these and see what the evidence actually says on these. All right, so first of all, he said, how can you have hundreds of thousands of years being documented in the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica? So first of all, you need to understand what an ice core is. This is where meteorologists will drill down into the caps, the ice caps, and pull up this cylinder of ice that has these layers in it that correspond to annual layers, a layer being deposited every year. And they can study these layers and learn like how much precipitation there was that year, whether there was any droughts. You can look to see if there's any volcanic activity in a particular year and so forth. And so he said, hey, we've got layers, hundreds of thousands of years worth of layering. And so how do we respond to that? Well, remember yesterday I talked about uniformitarianism. The idea that whatever is going on today, you assume it has always been that way in the past. This is a terrible assumption. We can easily show this to be a bad assumption in geology, and yet all of the dating methods that the old Earth community uses come down to this basic idea. Whatever's going on today, you assume it's always been that way in the past, and even the geologists, the secular geologists have now pulled back away from this strict uniformitarianism because they believe in catastrophes that don't happen today. And the minute you accept that, well, now you've got to acknowledge the possibility that rates have not always been what they are today. So if more than one layer of ice can be laid down in a single year, then this isn't hundreds of thousands of years worth of layering. And so that assumption would be annihilated. Well, sure enough, individual storms and cyclical weather patterns can cause layers that resemble annual layers in these ice cores. So when you keep in mind what the creation model would predict, that is that the flood caused an ice age. After the flood for a few hundred years, the conditions would be perfect for multiple layers within single years. In fact, as many as 1,000 annual cycles of ice in a single year. Now, modern estimates for ice accumulation in Greenland are less than 1 foot of accumulation each year. But even today, we see that estimate has not been constant, even in the last several decades. Even in modern times, we have examples of the rapid deposition of ice. For example, in 1988, ground-penetrating radar was used to discover the location of some abandoned World War II planes from 1942 in Greenland. And surprisingly, these planes had been buried under more than 260 feet of ice and snow since 1942. Now do the math on that. That's over 5 feet of ice accumulating every year, just for the last 46 years, not less than 1 foot per year. So even in modern times, uniformitarian estimates for ice layer accumulation don't coincide with the actual observable evidence when you get in the field and study this. So Bill Nye's use of the ice cores to prove an old Earth, it simply doesn't hold ice under scrutiny. All right, he argued that there are trees, specifically bristlecone pine trees, alive today that are as much as 6,800 years old, he said, and even a Norway spruce tree, old Chico, that's 9,550 years old at the time of this debate. And if so, of course, these trees would have had to have survived the flood and even possibly precede the creation week. So how would we explain that? Well, to understand how to respond to this, you have to understand what dendrochronology is. This is the study of tree ring patterns, and this isn't just to determine the age of a tree, but it also, again, will tell you things about climate conditions in the past and so forth. But today, as a general rule, we see one ring forming every year in trees. So you count up the number of rings and you get the age of the tree. Okay, so he mentions old bristlecone pine trees, 6,000 to 7,000 years old. But the first thing you always have to do when skeptics bring these things up is ask them to prove their point. Where are you getting that? He didn't give anything specific. What's he talking about? When you dig into the literature on this, you find that the oldest living bristlecone pine tree discovered in 2012 was dated as 5,062 years old, not 6,800. And it used tree ring counting plus cross dating in order to get its age, which means that if that is correct, it started growing around 3000 BC. So is that a problem for the creation model? Well, potentially, if you have a tree older than when the flood is thought to have occurred, the biblical model places the flood as recent as 2300 BC based on the chronologies of Genesis 11 coupled with history. So that would only be 4,300 years ago, but there's room to expand that number by several years in the chronologies of Genesis 11. We have an article on that on our website. So this already eliminates the problem that Bill Nye is bringing up here. But also consider that, once again, uniformitarianism is assumed with regard to tree ring accumulation. The assumption is one ring is forming every year. Now we know, again, even today, that rings don't always correlate to single years. Sometimes rings form annually. Whenever you have time-staggered, repeated disturbances caused by unusual weather, that has been shown to severely affect tree ring patterns. So again, when you consider that after the flood there would have been an ice age triggered by the flood, and in fact it's one of the great arguments for the flood, is the fact that there is evidence of an ice age and that the flood would have actually been necessary to trigger it. We talked about that yesterday. Then the conditions were perfect for subannual tree ring growth on our oldest trees. So it's very possible the bristlecone pines are actually several years younger than they appear. So where did he get 6,800 as opposed to 5,062? I have no idea. Did he just make that up? Or did he misspeak? And is he not talking about living trees? Okay, is he talking about dead trees that have been cross-dated? So this is where dendrochronologists will overlap tree ring patterns from living and even back to dead trees and try to overlap their patterns and get a history all the way back, even sometimes going into petrified trees to try to get a history of the trees back into history. But if you study this, one of the things you find is this is a very imprecise kind of method. It's very oftentimes subjective. It's ultimately up to the scientists studying it, because we have trees today in the same forest whose tree ring patterns oftentimes don't match, because this is a complicated equation affected by the distance the tree is from its main water source, the direction the sunlight hits it, the soil nutrients in the forest where that happens to be, storm patterns. And so he's arguing, well, we could get a date back over 8,000 years, and so the flood is only 4 to 5,500 years ago typically. And so if that's true, then maybe that would be a problem for the flood model. But again, it may not even be true, but let's consider what if it is. Notice it's only potentially a problem if we assume that all trees could not survive the flood. Okay, now the text doesn't say that. The text says all flesh that moved on the earth died, not the plants. Is it possible that there were areas of the planet that has less disturbance? Some trees could have been, and in fact likely would have been, more robust, stronger, due to the optimized nature of the pre-flood environment, remember, that is very different, more conducive to long life, bigger size, health, and so forth. But interestingly, even today, Bert Craig of the Department of Horticulture and Forestry at Michigan State, he said there are many tree species that can survive for months underwater in flooding conditions. Horticulturalists Whitlow and Harris produced a monumental work on the effect of flooding on trees and documented dozens of species today that are able to survive deep flooding for a growing season, even more than a year. And so if trees survive the flood, either because they survive being underwater or because in some cases maybe saplings were even brought on the ark for all we know, then trees with even over 6,000 tree rings wouldn't be a problem. Now that said, even if cross-dating can legitimately take you back thousands of years further than the flood and even further than creation, we also have to consider another part of our model, and that is that God definitely created the universe with an appearance of age, a mature creation. So for example, Adam and Eve were not created as zygotes. Okay, they're already able to reproduce, communicate, carry out biology in the case of Adam, who's naming the animals and so forth. Starlight would be expected to be here in order for it to be able to be used for the purposes stated in Genesis 1:14. There could have been both daughter and parent elements in rocks, therefore giving them an immediate appearance of age. And in fact, you would expect tree rings in the trees of the garden and across the planet in order for the trees to already be bearing fruit so that Adam and Eve could eat it. Okay, so you've got to have tree rings in the trees to support a fully mature tree, or it falls over or breaks because the tree rings give it strength. So bottom line, tree ages can't even be conclusively known due to the possibility, or at least of these older trees, due to the possibility of subannual rings and the subjective nature of cross-dating. Now, the one specific example of a tree that he gave was this Norway spruce tree, Old Chico, which he said is 9,550 years old. Now, again, you dig into the literature on this, and you find that this tree was dated not even using dendrochronology, but carbon dating. And so this is not typically listed among the verified oldest trees, because carbon dating is understood to be notoriously imprecise and suspicious beyond just a few thousand years, caused in large part due to its foundational assumptions, in this case due to the effect of the Earth's magnetic field on the production rate of C14, the assumption that the ratio of C14 to C12 in the atmosphere has remained constant throughout history. Scientists now reject that. Archaeologist Brian Fagan of UC Santa Barbara even came out and said carbon dating is not infallible. In general, single dates should not be trusted. So tree ages simply can't be used to disprove the creation model. Number 3, according to Bill Nye, there are human populations that are far older than that, the flood, with traditions that go back farther than that, okay? And so if that's true, that would seem to contradict the biblical text, because all pre-flood civilizations should be annihilated in the flood, and then only those civilizations emerging specifically after Babel should have a distinct tradition that goes back to that point. Well, again, you have to ask, what civilization is he referring to? He's not specific. He doesn't come out and say anything in particular, so we're left to guess and make his argument for him. Is he talking about China? Records in China go back to 1600 BC. Beyond that is only uncorroborated legend that exists. So Chinese history cannot be said to pose a problem for the creation model? Is he talking about Sumer? 2700 BC is the date for the earliest known Sumerian king. The Sumerian language is said to be the oldest written language. It's claimed to go back to 3100 BC. But according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the chronology of the first half of the third millennium is largely a matter for the intuition of the individual author. In other words, it's subjective. Carbon-14 dates are at present too few and far between to be given undue weight. Consequently, the turn of the fourth to third millennium is to be accepted with due caution and reservations as the date of the invention of writing. So even the date of 3100 is speculative, and even if it's right, it still falls after possible flood date estimates, which can be as high as 3500 BC or more. Is he talking about Egypt? Scholars consider 3100 BC to be the commencement of the first Egyptian dynasty, and again, it can't be known conclusively for the same reasons as Sumer, due to the inexact nature of tree ring dating, pottery comparisons, C14, and historical records. And some scholars argue that that date can be collapsed a few hundred more years into the 2000s BC. But either way, all of these dates from China, Sumer, and Egypt can fit within the biblical model. It's not a problem. Now, bottom line, his argument doesn't carry any weight. It doesn't disprove the Bible, but I do notice an interesting pattern here. The oldest trees date back to about 3100 BC. The Egyptian dynasty, the first Egyptian dynasty, goes back to about 3100 BC. The origin of the written language in Sumer goes back to about 3100 BC, with no verifiable civilizations before that time. That's actually exactly what we'd predict if the flood in Babel happened. Something significant seems to have happened prior to that point, and so the post-story of the flood is being verified from multiple independent directions, interestingly. Number 4, if there was a flood, how do you get the animals out there to Australia once they leave the ark? So Australia is way out there, away from any continent. Any animal that was on Australia before the flood should have been killed. So how do you get the kangaroos out there after the flood? Well, number 1, keep in mind, if this is a problem for creationists, guess who it's also a problem for? Evolutionists. How do you get animals to Australia? I mean, they don't argue that there was a single-celled organism that evolved into kangaroos separate over there just on Australia. They don't say that. So how do you get animals out there to Australia? Whatever you come up with, why wouldn't it be valid for us as well? Number 2, now Bill Nye summarily dismissed the idea of a land bridge from Asia to Australia without giving that any thought, because he's thinking from a secular perspective. But really, he's not considering what is actually underneath the surface of the water there. The water between those islands can be misleading. It hides what's really there. Here's a map of the Pacific sea floor and shows that the continental shelf of China actually extends all the way down to the continental shelf of Australia with only a relatively small gap between the two. And notice this ring of islands that goes all the way up there. And so again, whenever you take into account the post-flood ice age, where you got more, the sea levels are going to be lower because more water is trapped in the ice caps, then that is going to uncover a lot of this land and allow possibly creatures to travel all the way down there to Australia. And of course, we talked yesterday about the Pangea idea. The creation model doesn't have any problem with the idea of Pangea, the idea that all the continents were once together in one place. We just have a problem with how fast they would argue that that has occurred. Again, they're thinking uniformitarian. Whatever rates we see going on today have always been that way in the past, and yet we have evidence that that is not the case. These plates have moved much faster in the past, based in which lines up with creationist predictions. Remember, all the fountains of the great deep are broken up, which suggests the breakup of the ocean floor and possibly the commencement of plate tectonics. We would just argue that it would have been much faster at the beginning. Today, continental separation rate is as fast as your fingernails grow, but not during the flood. And interestingly, we have some recent research by Yale University scientists that provides evidence for what we are claiming, that the plates used to move much faster at some point, at least 3 times faster than they do today. Here's what their study has found. These observations suggest that either, notice, non-uniformitarian, right, against uniformitarianism, plate tectonics, or an episode of rapid true polar wonder. This is where the actual poles are shifting. Remember, I told you yesterday that one of the things we find when we study the ocean floor is that north and south flips as you're moving towards the mid-ocean ridges and cross over and keep going, which suggests that either north and south are just turning for some strange reason, or that the crust itself has dislodged from the mantle and is actually sliding on the mantle. And we would say this is going on in the flood. I mean, this is crazy things going on, but they're recognizing there's something going on. Rapid true polar wonder, where the north and south are moving. And notice when it is thought to have occurred. During the Cambrian explosion of animal life, which we would say is the beginning of the flood. This is exactly what we would expect to happen. And in fact, even the conventional scientists, the geologists and geophysicists are discovering this. But there's also other options for the creation model as well. So with the Pangea idea, of course, if the continents were all together at one point, then they wouldn't have been as far apart as they are today, which would allow migration between some of these continents. But also you have, because of the post-flood ice age, you've got frozen channels in some cases. So for example, we know that the English Channel would have been frozen and allowed passage across the Bering Strait. You would have had also the possibility of migration there. But also there would have been, no doubt, the pre-flood forests that are, a lot of those trees would have been ripped up and forming massive log mats on the waters of as the flood, for example, is receding. And so on. Is it possible that there would have been animals on these big masses of trees and debris? But before anybody should scoff at that, notice this is a picture from 2012 of Spirit Lake near Mount St. Helens. This is 32 years after the big 1980 eruption. And notice this floating log mat from this catastrophic event that is still around today. And notice this. This is an image from the Telegraph, a popular newspaper out of the United Kingdom. And the title of the article that contains the picture, Massive Floating Rubbish Islands from Japan Tsunami Spotted on the Pacific. So you've got this major catastrophic event, this major tsunami. It creates what they call a rubbish island, and it's out there on the ocean. And so this, for example, is a shot of this island moving across the Pacific towards the U.S. West Coast. This particular debris island is 69 miles long, and it covers an expanse of 2.2 million square feet. All right, now notice this picture. In the description, it explains that members of the Japan Coast Guard found and rescued this dog from this debris island, from this tsunami, 3 weeks after the tsunami. So this dog is out there on this debris island, surviving for 3 weeks after the tsunami occurred. So this is not at all outlandish to suppose that there would have been even bigger debris islands of material found worldwide after the flood, and it's possible that animals would have been even floating on these immediately after the flood. And as added evidence of the legitimacy of this theory, recent genetic analysis suggests that the marsupials on Australia, including the kangaroo, originated in South America before they moved to Australia. Okay, and so when we look at the projections of what the ocean currents would have looked like in the Paleocene and the Oligocene, which is immediately after the flood, we see there would have likely been an ocean current moving straight from South America to Australia. And in fact, ocean currents are argued to be how various creatures got from South America to the famous Galapagos Islands that Darwin studied. So even he used this argument to try to support evolution. So if a tsunami in one small area of the world could make such a floating island of trees and debris, then what in the world would a global flood cause? And of course, one other final possibility, how you get animals to Australia, humans could have carried them. And now granted, they can't consider that as a possibility because humans aren't around yet from their perspective, but we would say they're around the whole time. And so this is not a problem for the flood model. It's more of a problem for them, if anybody. Number 5. According to Bill Nye, we got 16 million species on the planet today, and if you have only 7,000 on the ark 4,000 years ago, that's 11 completely new species emerging every day since the flood. And I have to admit, I was like, wow, how do we explain that? That seems pretty strong. What's going on there? and you don't have anything to be concerned about. One of the things that my dad highlighted to me a lot when I was growing up is if you ever hear something that kind of shakes you, you don't really know how to answer that, fall back on what you know. Whatever the argument might be, this doesn't disprove that there's a God, and it doesn't disprove the inspiration of the Bible. That is already proven separately. We looked at that evidence on Friday. So you know the Bible's inspired, you know there's a God, and therefore you know a global flood happened. So this is just an interesting point that deserves some consideration. That's all this is. It doesn't disprove anything. All right, so let's dig in and see what's actually going on. First of all, he's right in his representation of one thing about the flood. We don't claim that all of the current animal varieties or even species were necessarily on the ark. Not every species of the dogs, for example, is on the ark. The text doesn't say that. Species is a very modern concept defined by humans in the last couple centuries. So we would argue what the text says. The different kinds of animals are representative on the ark, which we think is probably more representative of the dog kind, from which came the domestic dog breeds, the wolves, foxes, jackals, coyotes, dingoes. And similarly with the cats, there was probably a single cat kind from which came all the variety we have. Same thing with the elephants, from which even came the mastodons and the woolly mammoths, which creationists argue are part of the same kind based on our statistical analysis of that. The camel kind we have found actually includes the llamas and the alpacas as well. All of the bears, including the cave bears and so forth from the Ice Age, would all belong in the bear kind that would have been represented on the ark. And so remember, this is something more like the modern taxonomic category of family or genus is represented. And so there's no need to fit every single modern species on the ark, which would be difficult if not impossible. And there's no need to, because many of these species would have come about through diversification, what we call microevolution after the flood, not macroevolution, which is what Darwin argued for. And so there would have been representatives of each of the kinds that had the genetic material within them that allowed them to produce the diversity of creatures we have within those kinds today. So it's true, from those original kinds, the proto-species on the ark, so to speak, all of the current land and creeping thing species would have had to have emerged through some kind of rapid diversification process. Now, he said 7,000 species on the ark, quoting from Ken Ham. We don't know if it was 7,000 original species, although creation scientists are looking into that. We're currently estimating roughly 1,400 species could have been on the ark. Could have been more or less. So Bill Nye said, so you'd go out into your yard. No, by the way, notice the scoff here. There's something about scoffing that makes you feel intimidated. Young people, don't let scoffing make you feel intimidated. I mean, Peter warned us in 2 Peter 3, there's going to be scoffers. They're going to make you feel like an idiot, specifically about the flood. That's what he's talking about in 2 Peter 3. And so this is a perfect example of that. Bill Nye, listen to him scoff. So you'd go out into your yard, and you wouldn't just find a different bird, a new bird. You'd find a different kind of bird, a whole new species of bird every day. I mean, this would be enormous news. I mean, the last 4,000 years, people would have seen these changes among us. We see no evidence of that. There's no evidence of these species. And so again, you hear that, and you go, man, I'm an idiot. If I believe this, I'm stupid. I got to change my whole worldview based on. No, just dig into the evidence, see what's going on here. And it takes some time. It takes some time to dig in sometimes, figure out what's going on. First of all, again, we need to ask him, where did you get 16 million? That's a big claim for the number of species on the planet. This is one of the first things you got to do with skeptics is make them prove their point. There's a lot of disagreement about how many species there are on the planet, and that is a huge number comparatively. Some estimates are as low as 2 million. Including an estimate published by Science magazine back in 2013. One study from 2011 that's very well researched and accepted by many scientists, so much so that it was published in the Public Library of Science Biology Division. They estimated not 16 million, but less than 11 million species on the planet. And that estimate included not only the kingdom Animalia, but plantae, fungi, protozoa, chromista, archaea, and even bacteria. And keep in mind, these are estimates. The actual catalog number of species on the planet, 2011, when the study was done, was 1,438,769. they're projecting we'll eventually find 11 million, right? But that's just an assumption. Now also, Bill Nye has to be sure to accurately reflect what the Bible claims, okay? So from the 11 million, we need to subtract marine creatures, don't we? I mean, they wouldn't have been on the ark. So you remove the ocean-dwelling creatures, that brings you down under 9 million, and possibly other creatures could have survived in the water, various amphibians. We'll leave them on there for the sake of argument. Plants, the text doesn't mention plants being taken onto the ark. They're not flesh, Genesis 6:19, other than whatever plants the people on the ark are going to be eating. So that brings you down under 8.5 million. Now, incidentally, would the plants have been able to survive in the flood if they weren't taken on the ark? No doubt many would have been destroyed, again, but not necessarily all of them. Interestingly, most of the planet's plants are, in fact, under the water today. But also, there would have been potentially seeds on the ark, but more likely, if you consider all those dead plants that have been floating on the waters, the minute that the water receded, then those plants would have gone right back down to the land and started regerminating the land with the plants again. And in fact, studies show that seeds can survive being submersed in salt water for extended periods of time. And guess who actually did one of those studies? Darwin. All right, next, synonymous species. This is a big one. This is two names given to the same species. Creatures originally thought to be two distinct species, now they're considered one and the same, or one creature whose name has changed over time, and yet both names were accidentally counted. And so the PLOSB paper highlighted this weakness in species estimates, explaining that a survey of 2,938 taxonomists with expertise across all major domains of life revealed that synonyms are a major problem at the species level, and they believe that 17.9% of all named species could be synonyms, and possibly as much as 46.6%. And in fact, the World Register of Marine Species documents that 44.5% of all accepted marine species are synonyms. Okay, so for the sake of argument, let's take the lowest estimate of synonymous species. Only 17.9% of the remaining species are synonyms. That brings us down now under 7 million. And notice this is a far cry from 16 million. Okay, now, if the flood was 4,500 years ago, which is closer to our estimate, that brings us down to 4 species emerging every day, not 11. Now, if there are fewer species than the projections, which is virtually certain, more synonyms, which is highly likely, more years since the flood, which is possible, more species that could survive outside the ark, which is definite, and more representative kinds on the ark, which is likely, then notice that number continues to plummet, and yet we're still not done. Insects, other invertebrates, fungi, bacteria, protozoa, these are all included in the list of 11 million species, even though many of them wouldn't have been on the ark. Invertebrates, for example, make up 95 to 99% of the planet's animal species. Insects make up about half of the remaining 7 million. And so many of these, of course, would have been outside the ark, significantly reducing the remaining list. And then, of those that are left, keep in mind that there would have been fast reproductive rates for example, any of those smaller creatures, bugs and so forth, that would have caused rapid diversification immediately after the flood. Flies can lay as many as 100 eggs every day, and according to the American Society for Microbiology, one bacteria can make 10 billion in 10 hours. That's creepy. And so many new species would have been emerging in the centuries immediately following the flood, and the rate would have slowed down because of niche conservatism, for example. So, bottom line, 11 new species is nowhere near an accurate, fair assessment of the data. And even 4 is a huge overestimate, and most of those would be tiny creatures, completely unnoticed by humans, even though Bill Nye claimed with that scoff that this would have been noticed by humans. If you consider the fact that the Earth has a volume of over 1 trillion cubic kilometers, humans only inhabit a tiny space on the Earth comparatively, and therefore we're just not in a position to know what all is going on or in the Earth. The odds that a species would happen to emerge in your backyard, much less that it would be large enough for you to see it, is basically zero. But notice that in spite of that, here's the ironic thing. According to the literature, scientists are still discovering 15,000 new species that we've never noticed every year. And guess how many newly discovered species that averages out to every day? 41. Every day we're finding 41 new species that we didn't know existed. Who knows if they actually emerged, or whether we just hadn't noticed them yet. Bottom line is we're noticing a lot of new species every day. That may not be your discipline to go study that, but it's being noticed by biologists. All right, number 6. We got 2 more to go. We got like 10 minutes. According to Bill Nye, the National Zoo exhibits 400 species, and it takes 163 acres to do that. How could the Ark hold 14,000 animals? And again, it's uncertain whether that's even a good estimate of the representative proto-species on the Ark. Let's go with it for the sake of argument. Number 1, the Ark and the Zoo are not a good parallel, are they? I mean, the Ark is just about, it's not about display, it's about basic shelter. So a better parallel would be maybe a factory farm or high-density housing facilities where you can house tens of thousands of animals in tight quarters under one roof. Also, if the cubit is 18 inches, okay, so the length from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, then the Ark would have been 450 feet long, so a football field and a half long, by 75 feet wide, by 45 feet high. And creation geologist and biologist John Woodmarab did an extensive study on how much space would be required to house 16,000 animals, not just 14,000. So this is representatives from every genus, and he took into account food, water, waste disposal, heating, ventilation, lighting, and found that the Ark was more than adequate in size to house even that number of animals on that size Ark. But also consider, what if humans were generally larger in the pre-flood era? Due to better health and life longevity. We know that there were enormous reptiles existing in the past, as well as enormous fruit and plants, and we know of bigger humans. And remember, I mentioned yesterday Homo heidelbergensis, where even the secular guys are saying there's this group of humans that were huge. We don't even know exactly how big they were, over 7 feet tall as a general rule for this group. And so what if at the time the cubit was larger than 18 inches? Which some estimates actually make it. So for example, if you just up from 18 to 25 inches for a cubit, it more than doubles the volume of space on the Ark, from 1.5 million cubic feet to 4 million cubic feet. And of course, we can also reason that the animals would likely not have been full-sized animals. Why? Why would they would have been juveniles? Because smaller animals take up less space, they eat less food, assuming they're not in a hibernative state, they make less waste, and this is important, younger animals would make it where those animals could survive longer after the flood to help repopulate the planet. And so we would expect them to be younger. And so bottom line, there's plenty of space for many, many animals. Bill Nye's criticisms don't disprove the biblical account, and it actually gives it a chance to shine. What about the dinosaurs? Would dinosaurs have been on the Ark? Well, creation scientists know, we know with a high level of confidence where the flood begins in the geologic strata. Talked about that yesterday. The Cambrian strata begins the flood. And so the Precambrian is pre-flood, probably day 3 rock. And so the line separating the two is known as the Great Unconformity that goes across the entire planet. It's an erosional surface that goes across the whole planet. The dinosaur fossils that have been found are in those flood strata above them, and we know they're alive when the flood hits because we see their footprints. So that means dinosaurs, if they're land-dwelling creatures, they're on the Ark. All right, so how do we explain that? Well, one of the things you got to keep in mind is the average size of an adult dinosaur is about the size of an American bison. But you also have to consider that a juvenile form, again, would be likely. We actually have some replicas of sauropod dinosaur eggs that are about this big that the titanosaurs came out of. Okay, so we're talking about the ones that are bigger than this building. They start in an egg this big. Okay, so there's not even a problem fitting the dinosaurs on the Ark in juvenile form, which we would predict. Number 7, Bill Nye said you've got a specific example of a large wooden vessel that whose wooden planks were so long that the twisting and buckling of those planks caused there to be leakage, and ultimately the Wyoming sank. And so how do we explain that? If wooden planks tend to twist and buckle, and you've got an even larger wooden vessel like the Ark, wouldn't that be unseaworthy? All right, number 1, as with the Ark and the Zoo, the Wyoming and the Ark aren't good parallels. The Wyoming had 6 masts and several sails, and that would have caused immense torsion from the wind filling those sails on the open seas. It's definitely going to cause twisting and buckling. And I think it's amazing he made that argument because he's a mechanical engineer and should have known better. This is not a good parallel. The ark, of course, wouldn't have had sails. It didn't have anywhere to go. Okay? And so the torsion problem would have been greatly reduced. And on top of that, we actually have examples of large ancient wooden ships that have been found dating back to immediately after the flood in Egypt that are equipped with a sophisticated engineering system, an interlocking plank system called a mortise and tenon joint, that are known to help prevent twisting and buckling and add strength to the frame. So clearly, seaworthy, large wooden ships were not out of the question for the ancients. And in fact, I would argue this is an example of pre-flood technology that probably survived through Noah and his sons. As exactly what we would expect. Whatever the pre-flood technology was, the bulk of it was totally wiped out. And we don't even know what they were capable of other than some hints in Genesis 4. But in the case of civil engineering and nautical engineering, that kind of information survives through Noah and his family. And immediately after the flood, you have these amazing examples of that technology continuing. Number 3, no one knows what gopher wood was. And God was very specific in choosing this as the wood for the ark. And Moses mentioned several other species of wood in the Pentateuch that we know what they are. The terebinth tree, green poplar, almond, palm, willow, fig, olive, pomegranate, chestnut. Many others are mentioned outside of the Pentateuch, but God chose gopher, and we don't even know for sure what it is. There is no doubt no modern equivalent to this. Because you got to keep in mind, again, part of the creation model is there's been genetic entropy going on for thousands of years now. So the pre-flood trees would be nothing like what we have today. We've gone through a lot of genetic degeneration, even in our own genomes, and the same thing with every other living creature on the planet. No, there is no modern equivalent to this kind of wood. There's no way. And so it's highly unlikely that we have that equivalent. Gopher wood was clearly chosen because God knew what this ark needed to have, wood-wise, for it to survive. But also number 4, notice, the Wyoming, in spite of its problems, stayed afloat for 15 years, while the ark only needed to stay afloat for a few months, right? So bottom line, Bill Nye didn't show the ark to be unseaworthy. Quite the contrary. His accusations, once again, give the creation model an opportunity to shine even more. Now, interestingly, concerning the engineering of this vessel, the dimensions of the ark have been shown to produce a seaworthy vessel for this kind of purpose. The SS Great Britain in service in the 1800s had a dimension ratio of 332 to 51 to 32 in height, almost exactly that of the ark. You have in World War II this group of ships called the Ugly Ducklings. And similar to the ark, these are cargo ships. They're built not for speed or combat. They just are transporting a lot of stuff over the harsh sea. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, one of those vessels, notice in feet is 442 by 57 by 28. And so whenever you convert cubits to feet on the ark, again, you see this is pretty much the same as those vessels. Also, the more recently designed super jumbo barges, which, again, like the O'Brien, these are a better parallel to the ark. Their purpose is just to stay afloat while they transport immense amounts of cargo. Again, they have length to width ranges that very much are similar to the ark. The very large crude oil carriers, the VLCC, the super tankers, again, their length to width to height in meters, very close to the ark's dimension ratio. So notice a trend here. If you want to build a boat that's intended to haul enormous amounts of material out on the harsh sea, then you want to use a length to width to height ratio like the ark. And so bottom line, clearly somebody knew engineering and knew what needed to be done to make this happen. He was no amateur. All right, so the biblical creation model cannot withstand scrutiny. You should scoff at it, and we're a bunch of dummies for believing in this. And no, of course not. You never need to feel intimidated by these kind of arguments. Sometimes you got to dig to see what's going on, but you can always figure that out. All right, I wish I had time to address some other things, but we are out of time. So thank you for your attention.